Central bank digital currencies may represent the most far-reaching change in the individual's relationship with money in the past 100 years. Cash in digital form, when it becomes a reality, will be different from electronic money or digital banking, as a citizen's primary relationship will be with the sovereign issuer, with the central bank, and not with a payments company or a deposit-taking bank. The digital revolution in e-commerce this century has seen a complete transformation in how we live our lives. No firm characterizes this more than Amazon, and Amazon Web Services, AWS, which provides the cloud technology behind the leading financial services organizations worldwide. I am delighted to be joined today by David McKeith, a Principal Business Development Manager in AWS's public sector organization. David, thank you for joining us today. One of the main objectives for central banks when considering a digital currency is to improve the domestic payments system, making payments more resilient and fairer to the customer by removing additional costs. So how can central banks meet this objective? What should be considered when developing plans for a CBDC?
Thank you, Chris, and very excited to be part of this discussion. And great question to start off with, because that is absolutely a primary question that lots of central banks are asking themselves. The reasons are different in different countries. It could be because they're uncomfortable with lack of competition, or it could be because they're looking for another payments mechanism to help with financial inclusion, for example. But I would say there are maybe 4 principles that a central bank can consider. And firstly, we're talking here about a retail CBDC. So this is something that's available to every citizen, every business throughout a country. And then secondly, another kind of fundamental principle is that a 2-tier CBDC is what we would recommend. And by 2-tier, let me illustrate that with this slide. So what this is showing is CBDC operating where there's a direct relationship between users here on the right-hand side and a central bank. So that ultimately the claim for a user is on the central bank and they're not at risk if their bank disappears. It's 2-tier in that there's a layer of payment service providers who interface directly with the users. And there are many reasons for this, but it essentially allows the private sector to play to their strengths and the central bank to focus on what it's good at. And that brings me to a third guiding principle, which is that the 2-tier system allows the CBDC central architecture and solution to be as simple as possible. And that's a good guiding principle for central banks to take into account. And then fourthly, we talk here about different potential technology options for a CBDC. Fundamentally, a CBDC is about providing 2 things. It provides a way of recording ownership of digital currency, and it provides infrastructure for citizens and businesses to make payments using CBDC. And so, ultimately, this is something similar to what existing solutions like RTGS and faster payment systems and commercial payment systems like SWIFT and Visa have been providing for some time. We should learn the lessons from that. Fundamentally, it's about providing technical performance at scale. And that, I would say, is a 4th principle that central banks should take into account when they're considering the technology that sits behind their CBDC solution.
Thank you, David. That's very comprehensive. Financial inclusion is often discussed as one of the potential benefits of a central bank digital currency. Now, for citizens in emerging market countries where cash is often the only option, how can a digital currency match the characteristics and the advantages which cash has? The ease of use, the ability to carry out transactions any time of day, regardless of whether you're online or offline.
Yeah, well, that's another fascinating question. There's a lot of research has been done about different ways to provide offline capability. And if you looked at the diagram I was sharing just a second ago, what you can see there in the the arrows and the transaction flow, that's really describing a system for online payments. And I was describing blockchain or centralized solutions as the underlying technology for online payments. But the offline capability is essentially a separate system. It has its own technology, has its own questions in terms of architecture, and it's not powered by a blockchain solution or a centralized database. This is a system for enabling secure transactions by secure protocols for exchanging messages between secure devices. And underpinning that is the requirement for a trusted execution environment within those devices that assure the security of those transactions. And where this really gets interesting, to your question about how it should be designed, is in the interface between that offline system and the online system, and how CBDC is effectively checked out from the online system for offline use and then checked back in again. And the key question is, should that be anonymous, right? So when CBDC is exchanged offline, should that be completely anonymous like cash? The benefit of that being that because it mirrors cash, it may be more attractive to citizens. It may actually enable more inclusion. But on the other side, if it operates in that way and part of the system is compromised, there's no way of tracing where maybe a counterfeiting or some kind of compromise to a device has happened. So that's the trade-off that central banks have to think about.
Yeah, so that's going to be one of the biggest dilemmas, isn't it? The trade-off between the advantages of knowing your customer, anti-money laundering legislation and so on, and actually giving people that knowledge that the anonymity is at the same level. Some of the central banks over these last 2 days have spoken about how it's perhaps impossible to completely replicate anonymity in a digital environment in the same way that you can with cash. But there's much still to be discovered here, and I'm very interested to see all the different types of innovations that are taking place. One of the other things we've heard a lot about over the past couple of days is programmable money. It represents an enormous opportunity. The idea that you can build functionality into a currency to support micropayments, to direct payments, and I can see why this is very appealing to policymakers. What do you see as the most obvious benefit of programmable money?
Yeah, well, the example you gave there, micropayments, is a really fascinating one. I think in many ways that's the most forward-looking and visionary of the potential use cases for programmable money. The idea that in a future Internet of Things, IoT world, you could have automatic payments for things like utility service like power, or providing information with the payment happening automatically with using CBDC. That is a fascinating use case. But actually, it's any situation where you make a payment and it's subject to some kind of condition. So another use case would be complex transactions in securities trading, for example. You could link different transactions with multiple parties, or have a purchase of securities which is conditional on exchange rate reaching a certain point, or it could be linked to the price for a security reaching a certain level. Of all the use cases that I've been discussing with customers, it's the use case where a government is able to use CBDC for financial support for citizens, and makes a payment using CBDC, which is conditional on how it's used. So used for specific purposes or within a particular period of time is probably the most talked about. But I think what I would say is, you know, the variety of these use cases is so large. I mentioned that design principle of keeping the CBDC system as simple as possible. And what one consideration then is, how can you provide for all of those different possibilities with one CBDC system? The alternative to that is, as this next slide illustrates, is to rely on the network and infrastructure, the ecosystem, if you like, of payment service providers to do that. And this slide shows both programmable money piece, which we were talking about earlier, and how that could be provided by payment service providers interfacing with the CBDC system, and also the offline payments and how they could operate. So this PSP ecosystem is a fundamental consideration, I think, for central banks when they're thinking about how to design a CBDC system, because this is how they're going to achieve the objectives of improved innovation and competition, and also how they can deliver those policy objectives around inclusivity through offline payments and all of the functionality of programmable money.
Thank you. Just staying on that slide, David, I mean, the thing that strikes me about that is there is a strong assumption here that there's a rich partnership between the public and private sector here, because when you talk about the sort of competition and the different ways of developing what the programmable options are, it very much sounds like it's sort of the private sector developing the innovations here to meet the public sector policy objectives. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting things about CBDCs. It will have to be a public-private partnership in some ways for an element such as programmable money services to become a reality. In terms of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different technology options available for CBDC, such as blockchain and centralized databases, where do you see the biggest strengths and the biggest stumbling blocks, the biggest weaknesses as CBDCs are come down to decision points within central banks?
Yeah, well, that's another great question, Chris, because this is obviously central to a lot of our customers thinking now as they consider architecture and technology choices. And that question about whether to use a distributed ledger solution based on blockchain or a centralized database for the core of the CBDC solution is the one that comes up most often. In order to help provide some guidance on that, we recently published 2 white papers on CBDC, which you can see some screenshots from those here. And those are available from the aws.amazon.com website. Just to give you, at the time available, a kind of quick view on some of those strengths and weaknesses. If you take the core question of security and resilience, blockchain solutions based on using distributed ledger are really interesting, because by their nature, the ledger is distributed over multiple nodes, and the system can keep operating even if one or several of those nodes is unavailable, as long as there's enough to form a consensus. On the other hand, because there are these multiple nodes, that increases the difficulty of maintaining all of those nodes under configuration control in terms of the software and the hardware. And that can mean opening up more security vulnerabilities, a larger attack surface for bad actors. And there are also questions about confidentiality as a result, because the information is spread so widely.
Thank you very much. Many decisions and interesting issues for central banks to consider as we undertake this journey. David McKeith, thank you very much.